Sir, please lower your voice. I will not. Someone needs to say it. The words cracked through the narrow cabin like a dropped tray. Row 14 froze. Row 15 leaned forward. From row 12, a soft overhead light flickered, catching the silver edge of a drink cart and the tension in the air. Marcus Hale, a tall, quiet man in his early 50s, looked up from his seat beside the window. He had been reading a message from his daughter, but the rising commotion pulled him back into the present. He glanced down the aisle toward the source of the voice, an agitated passenger with a rigid posture and flushed cheeks. Flight attendant Grace Leland stood planted in front of him, hands steady on the drink cart, her voice measured but firm. Sir, I need you to stay seated and speak respectfully. People can hear everything you're saying. The man pointed past her toward another passenger, John Rivera, a middle-aged airport mechanic returning to Seattle. John had simply asked the man to move his backpack so he could take his aisle seat. He now sat stiffly, eyes down, breathing through the tension. The hostile man's next line wasn't shouted, but it cut sharper than the first, a racist remark, cruel in tone if not volume. The words weren't repeated by anyone, but the reaction was instant. A woman in row 11 gasped. A veteran across the aisle straightened. John's hands tightened around the armrests, though his face remained composed. Marcus felt something shift inside him. He had lived through moments like this, moments where silence felt like surrender. Yet he knew the rules of the air. Stay calm, stay seated, let the crew lead. Still, his pulse climbed. Grace stepped closer. Sir, what you just said is unacceptable. I'm going to ask you again to lower your voice and stop making comments about other passengers. The man scoffed, brushing her aside with words alone. I know my rights. The aircraft hummed around them, ventilation rushing, seatbelts clicking, the soft tremor of steady altitude. A micro cliffhanger hung in the silence between each breath. Marcus watched Grace exhale and tap her service button. A small chime sounded. Passengers exchanged looks. Something was about to escalate. A minute later, another attendant, Evelyn Brooks, arrived. Calm, composed, late 40s. Grace, what's happening? Before Grace could respond, the man thrust a finger in the air. I'm being targeted because I spoke the truth. He gestured at John again, and the cabin stirred with disapproval. Evelyn raised a hand. Sir, you need to stop addressing other passengers. Please hand me your ID so I can note this disturbance. That request, simple and procedural, shifted the entire cabin's tone. People knew it meant the crew was documenting the event. Marcus noticed John quietly turning his phone camera on, not pointing at anyone, just aimed at his own tray table with audio recording. A tiny red dot blinked. The man refused the ID, gripping the armrest, his voice pushing louder. You can't make me do anything. But this time, before the attendants could answer, a voice from the back spoke clearly. We can hear you up here too, sir. Please stop. It was a retired teacher in row 18. Her tone carried the weight of decades of authority. The man jerked around, startled. That interruption rattled something deeper than earlier warnings. Grace didn't waste the moment. Sir, we are in air. Your behavior is affecting the safety and comfort of everyone on board. If you continue, we will have to notify the captain. Again, the man refused to back down. Marcus felt his hand hover near the call button. He hadn't pressed it yet, but something told him that before this flight touched down in Seattle, the truth of what happened here would matter. The soft chime sounded overhead, timestamp, 10:42 a.m. The crew often used that moment to check in with the cockpit. It made the tension feel suddenly official. Grace leaned in one final inch and said, Sir, I need you to choose your next words carefully. The man inhaled sharply, ready to strike again with another cruel insult. And then a single quiet voice from the captain's radio broke through the cabin speakers, calm but unmistakably authoritative. Grace, tell him we're aware. Passengers straightened. Eyes widened. Even Marcus felt something shift. Whatever happened next would decide the fate of row 14, and maybe more. Enjoying this? Tap subscribe for tomorrow's story. Marcus Hale sat very still, the thin world of his airplane seat compressing around him. He watched the overhead bins, the little vents, the fluorescent strip of the reading light. He had flown this route before, Dallas to Seattle, but never like this, with something taut and raw hanging over the cabin. He was on his way to see his daughter, Emily, perform in a small-town theater. She had sent him a photo that morning, her in a rehearsal dress, smiling, and Marcus had saved it to his pocket like a talisman. That image steadied him now, but it did not make the exchange in row 14 any easier to ignore. He was an IT consultant by trade, pragmatic about systems and policies. At 52, he preferred order. Tonight's flight had been routine until a passenger's voice carved through it. Marcus had no official title aboard the plane. He had only a history, a childhood where he learned silence was safer than speaking, and a middle life where he sometimes wished he had said more. Grace and Evelyn worked the aisle like a practice duet, soft commands, firm boundaries. Marcus had watched them before, seen economy of gestures that managed threats without loudness. He admired that craft. He also remembered times when craft alone could not right an immediate wrong. John Rivera, the man the antagonist singled out, sat with his hands folded. His jaw had tightened after the comment. His eyes were steady, not angry, but wounded in a way Marcus recognized. Marcus thought of his daughter's voice, her small insistence that he stand up for people when it mattered. That thought nudged like a current beneath his ribs. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The ventilation hummed, a steady machine note. It made Marcus more aware of small sounds, a chime, a seatbelt buckle, the soft rustle of a newspaper. A woman 3 rows back dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A little boy in row 20 mouthed the scene and then returned to his toy, oblivious. When the captain's voice had come over, calm, clipped, Marcus had felt the balance tip. The crew was now documenting. That meant forms, possibly a police report on landing, maybe a written complaint. For some, documentation meant justice. For others, it was a box-ticking exercise. Marcus remembered a day 20 years earlier, a town hall meeting where someone's words had ignited an injustice that sat on his conscience for a long time. He had watched the complaint forms collect dust afterward. He did not want another example of "we recorded it" to mean we forgot it. He wanted accountability that mattered. He considered his options. A passenger could be disruptive and nothing happened. A passenger could be disruptive and be escorted off on landing. He thought about the man's refusal to show ID and that cold phrase, "I know my rights." Marcus had spent his career respecting rules, but he also believed rules only worked when people enforced them. He clicked his tongue once, a small private noise. He had his phone in his hand, just below the tray. John had activated his own phone's recorder. Tiny red pulsed on John's screen. Marcus thought about pressing the call button, but he did not want to create more noise or be labeled the instigator. He weighed discretion against courage. Evelyn approached with a calm, professional step. She tapped a slim notebook, and the badge at her hip made a soft metallic click as she reached for the man's arm. The sound was ordinary, but Marcus found it clarifying. A badge click, small authority, registered as a geometric line dividing right from wrong. "Sir," Evelyn said, "we need to see your identification now." Her voice was low but precise. The man's reply was a rising tide of grievance. "You can't make me," he began. Grace interrupted, voice steady. "If you refuse, we will inform the captain and document the disturbance." That could lead to refusal of carriage. There was a rustle as the man shifted in his seat. A family nearby exchanged anxious glances. Marcus saw the stewardesses' faces, professional masks, but their eyes read worry. He thought of Emily's recital, how she'd arranged for him to sit in the second row so she could spot him in the audience. He imagined telling her he had kept quiet because he feared causing a scene. The image of her face in the rehearsal photo felt suddenly heavier in his pocket. Marcus felt something else now, the slow building of a decision. It did not come from bravado. It came from a ledger he kept in his head, small, tally-like entries of moments where courage had been deferred and change stalled. He did not want to add another line for silence. He positioned his phone more deliberately on the tray, not to film, but to make his presence known. He did not want to inflame the man, only to bear witness in a situation where words alone might be twisted later. The red dot on John's screen continued to blink. Across the aisle, an older veteran cleared his throat and said, "Captain, you might want to advise." It was a small, ordinary utterance that felt like a pebble dropped into still water. At the front, the captain's voice sounded again through the speaker, firmer this time. "We're monitoring. Please comply with the crew." The man bristled. "You can't do that to me." Evelyn's hand hovered over the radio. Marcus watched her breathe in measured. For a moment, the world narrowed to the span between her badge click and the captain's next instruction. The outcome teetered. Marcus's hand trembled, not from fear of physical harm, but at the weight of the choice. He could step in, complicate things, risk confrontation. He could remain an observer, a witness to record but not to act. He looked at John. John looked back once, a micro-expression, gratitude or plea. Marcus could not tell. Then the man stood. The man's sudden rise from his seat sent a ripple through the narrow aisle. Shoulders tensed, heads lifted, belts shifted as passengers braced for whatever came next. It wasn't a violent motion, just abrupt enough to shake the delicate balance Grace and Evelyn had been maintaining. "Sir, please sit down," Grace said, palms open, her voice low but resolute. The man didn't listen. He stepped forward half a pace, as far as the limited legroom allowed. "I'm not the problem here," he insisted. Another pointed gesture toward John, shouldn't have said anything to me in the first place. John didn't move. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady. "All I did was ask you to move your backpack so I could sit down." The remark wasn't sharp. It wasn't loud. It simply placed truth between them like a small, unpolished stone. The man scoffed. "Oh, sure. Make me look like the bad guy." Typical. A hushed murmur ran through the surrounding rows. Marcus felt it like a shift in air pressure. People were no longer confused. They were aligned quietly around a shared sense of right and wrong. Evelyn positioned herself slightly to the man's side, angled so she could block any attempt to move farther up the aisle without making physical contact. Her training showed in every measured inch of her posture. "Sir," she said, "if you don't sit down, we'll have to consider this a safety interference." The words carried weight. Marcus knew enough aviation regulations to understand that interfering with a crew member was a serious matter. Still, he watched the man's jaw clench, not in fear, but in indignation. The hum of the ventilation deepened, or perhaps Marcus only noticed it more sharply. He could almost hear the whole aircraft listening. A man in row 12 coughed, a tense, accidental sound that broke the stillness. The man in row 14 turned. Everyone needs to mind their own business. Marcus met his eyes for the briefest second, just long enough to see something flicker in them. Not power. Not control. Uncertainty. Grace said gently, "Sir, please. People are uncomfortable. Take your seat so we can continue the flight." For the first time, the man hesitated. His breathing slowed. His hands dropped a fraction. Marcus wondered whether the conflict might deflate right there. But then the man looked back at John, and something hardened again. "He provoked me. I'm not apologizing." John's response came quietly. "I never asked for an apology." That simple dignity held the cabin in place. Marcus admired it, steady, restrained, the kind of strength his daughter once said she hoped to grow into. The man's face reddened. "So now you're pretending you're above all this?" Marcus sensed a tremor in the air, like a string pulled too tight. He swallowed and shifted in his seat. The decision he'd been weighing earlier pressed itself to the forefront again. If I stay silent, nothing changes. If I speak up, maybe it tips the balance. Grace glanced across the aisle. She wasn't asking Marcus for help, but she wasn't shutting out the passengers either. Her eyes carried a tiredness he recognized, the look of someone trying to protect 100 people at once with only procedural words to shield her. Evelyn touched the radio again. A soft beep sounded as she prepared to notify the captain of continued noncompliance. That beep changed everything. The man snapped. "Don't you dare call the captain on me. I'm the one being harassed." A woman in row 11 whispered, "That's not true," loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The man heard it. His attention jerked toward her. "Stay out of this." Now passengers were no longer still. Marcus saw heads turning, postures straightening. The scene had grown from a localized dispute to a cabin-wide unease. "Sir," Evelyn said, still calm, "this cannot continue. I'm asking again, return to your seat." A beat. 2. The man's shoulders tightened, but he finally sank back into his seat. Not gently, more like a forced descent, but he sat. Grace let out a breath she'd been holding. Evelyn recorded the time in her small notebook. Timestamp, 10:51 a.m. Marcus waited for tension to release around them, but it didn't. The quiet held like a storm cloud that refused to drift away. John turned slightly toward Grace. "I'm fine," he said softly, as if trying not to draw more attention. "Really?" But Marcus saw the strain in John's features, the burden of needing to be fine for the sake of everyone else. Grace nodded, though her eyes lingered on John for a moment longer than procedure required. Then she moved forward with the service cart, trying to restore normalcy, a fragile attempt to reset the flight. But Marcus could feel the cabin's nerves still stretched thin. The man's breathing was uneven. His fingers tapped on the armrest. He was seated, yes, but not calm. And deep inside Marcus's pocket, Emily's photo shifted against the fabric. The reminder of her, someone looking up to him, made a quiet, compelling echo in his mind. He knew the situation wasn't over. He knew the next escalation would demand clarity, not hesitation. And he felt something in himself settle into readiness. Because if this man lashed out again, Marcus would not stay silent. Marcus couldn't stop glancing toward the quiet man in the back of the plane. The one with the folded magazine, the steady posture, the calm that seemed too intentional to be accidental. He looked like someone accustomed to watching rooms, not merely being in them. Grace noticed him too. Her gaze brushed past him, never lingering long enough to draw attention, but long enough for Marcus to recognize the silent exchange they'd shared earlier. Evelyn closed her notebook and stepped back, giving the disruptive passenger space and giving herself a chance to breathe. The man slumped in his seat, angry energy coiled tightly beneath his stillness. He didn't speak, but the tension radiated from him like heat off asphalt. The rest of the cabin tried to ease back into normal rhythms. A woman resumed knitting. A businessman reopened his laptop. A couple whispered about their connecting flight. But Marcus could feel it. Everyone was listening without looking like they were listening. John sipped his water. His hand shook slightly. "I don't want trouble," he murmured. "You didn't start it," Marcus said. "And you didn't add to it." John gave a small, weary smile. "Doesn't always matter, does it?" Marcus felt the truth of that. He also felt something else, a quiet determination rising in his chest. Not anger, not pride, just a sense of what fairness should look like, even in a crowded airplane miles above the earth. Grace made her way back down the aisle, stopping near Marcus's row. "Thank you again," she whispered. "We're doing everything we can." "I know," Marcus replied. "You're handling it well." Evelyn approached the man in row 14 once more, this time with a measured tone. "Sir, please keep to yourself for the remainder of the flight. We'll be landing in a little over an hour." He let out a sharp breath. "Can't come soon enough." The words weren't loud, but they carried bitterness. He shot another look toward John, the kind that tried to provoke without speaking. John ignored it, but Marcus saw the strain. Across the aisle, the veteran softly muttered, "If he starts again, I'll say something." His wife placed a hand on his arm. "Let the crew handle it," she whispered. Marcus understood both sentiments. Another small sound drew his attention, the faint, controlled tap of the magazine closing in row 24. The quiet man stood, stretching his legs in the aisle. Nothing unusual, but something about the way he surveyed the cabin, quick, comprehensive, felt purposeful. He walked forward a few steps, paused near the galley as if waiting his turn for the restroom. Grace passed him in the aisle, and in that moment she barely whispered, "Thank you for staying alert." Marcus caught the edge of the exchange, subtle as a folded note. Grace returned to her tasks. The quiet man waited until she moved on, then continued toward the restroom with smooth, unhurried steps. But Marcus now understood. Someone on this plane was more than a bystander. And he hadn't revealed himself fully, not yet. The plane jolted slightly in a patch of light turbulence. A few passengers gasped. The seatbelt sign chimed again, even though it had never turned off. Evelyn made an announcement reminding everyone to stay seated. The man in row 14 gripped his armrests. "Great. Just great," he muttered under his breath. Marcus felt the ripple again, the quick lift of anxiety, whenever a destabilizing moment hit the cabin. Turbulence didn't cause conflict, but it exposed cracks. John straightened. "It's just air pockets," he said, more to reassure the nearby rows than himself. The man shot him a glare. "Stop talking to me." John didn't respond this time, but Marcus did. "You don't have to speak to him, sir," Marcus said calmly, addressing John. His tone was neutral, but meant to draw attention away from the man's hostility. "Just relax." The man scoffed. "Look at you, playing the hero." "No," Marcus replied, keeping his voice even. "Just trying to keep the peace." Evelyn stepped forward immediately. "Remember what we discussed," she told the man firmly. "Any more disruption will be reported directly." "You already reported me," he snapped. Evelyn didn't flinch. "And we are continuing to monitor." The man leaned back with a frustrated exhale, arms crossed, chin lifted defiantly. But he stayed quiet. Grace moved through the rows again, offering cups of water to anyone who looked tense. When she reached Marcus, she paused just long enough to speak quietly. "We appreciate your composure. It helps us more than you know." Marcus nodded. "I'm here if you need anything." She gave a grateful smile before moving on. Moments later, the quiet man from the back returned to his seat. He'd never fully revealed himself, never spoken loudly or introduced any authority, but the air felt different now, as if the crew had been reassured by his silent presence. Marcus filed the detail in his mind. Hidden authority. That will matter later. He could feel the narrative of the moment shifting, though neither Grace nor Evelyn gave any hint. The row lights dimmed slightly as the plane settled again into smoother air. Passengers exhaled in relief. But the man in row 14, he wasn't finished. His eyes darted from John to Marcus to the attendants, waiting for an opening, a misstep, a spark. Marcus sensed the next clash coming. And this time, it wouldn't be confined to raised voices. Something was about to break open. Something that would bring the quiet man in row 24 into the light. The next escalation didn't come with shouting. It came with silence, sharp, cold, deliberate. About 20 minutes after the turbulence eased, Grace began a second walkthrough with water. She moved slowly, checking faces, murmuring reassurance. When she reached row 14, she hesitated. The man sat still, but something in his posture had changed. He wasn't restless anymore. He was calculating. John noticed it too. He shifted slightly toward the window, shoulders drawing in. Marcus felt his instinct tighten, a quiet readiness he hadn't felt in years. Grace offered the man a cup. Water. He didn't take it. "I want your full name," he said. "Both of you." "I'm filing a complaint." Evelyn appeared almost instantly, as if summoned by the pressure drop in the row. "Sir, our names are on record with the airline. You'll receive them upon landing if you request them through proper channels." "That's not good enough," he snapped. "I want them now." "Sir, we don't provide personal identification in flight," Evelyn said carefully. "Policies protect our safety." He smirked. "Safety? Please. You both made this personal." He raised his phone, not to record, but to take a photo of Grace. Several passengers gasped. Not loudly. Just enough to fracture the fragile calm. "You can't do that," Grace said, stepping back. "Photos of crew members without consent are prohibited on this aircraft." The man lifted the phone higher. John's breath caught. "Sir, please don't." "Quiet," the man snapped. "I'm documenting my mistreatment." Marcus's pulse hammered. He had seen situations pivot around moments like this, when a small violation signaled a larger unraveling. Grace lifted her radio. "Captain, passenger has raised a phone to record crew, requesting guidance." Before the captain could answer, a voice came from row 24. Calm, even, precisely measured. "Miss Leland," the quiet man said. "May I speak with you a moment?" Grace turned. Her expression registered recognition, not of his face, but of something behind his words. She approached him. Marcus followed with his eyes, watching the quiet man's movements. He stood smoothly with quiet authority and opened a slim wallet. Inside was a small card. Not a badge, not a full credential, just enough identification to explain everything. Grace inhaled sharply. Not fear, relief. Evelyn joined them, and the man spoke quietly, just loudly enough for Marcus and a few nearby passengers to hear. "My name is Daniel Avery, Federal Air Marshal. I've been observing the situation since first contact." A stillness spread through the cabin, like a wave of clarity. Marcus felt his breath catch. So he was hidden authority. More than that, he was trained for exactly this. Daniel continued in the same steady tone. "We're past the threshold of routine crew management. The passenger's behavior has escalated beyond verbal disruption." Grace exhaled slowly. "We thought so." Evelyn asked, "Do we need to restrain him?" "Not yet," Daniel said. "But we're moving toward intervention." Stay with procedure. I'll take the lead if he crosses one more boundary. The man in row 14 noticed the shift. What's going on back there? Talk louder. Daniel stepped forward. Only one step, but it changed the air. Sir, he said, voice carrying just enough authority to register without introducing panic. Put the phone down. The man blinked. Who are you? Daniel held up the slim wallet. Open just a second. Federal Air Marshal. A murmur rippled through the nearby rows. Not fear, relief. The man scoffed. You're not serious. Daniel didn't blink. Put the phone down. Now, for the first time, the man hesitated in genuine uncertainty. He lowered the phone, but only a few inches. This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything. Daniel spoke quietly, but each word landed with precision. You verbally targeted another passenger. You raised your voice repeatedly. You ignored lawful crew instructions. You attempted to photograph crew members without consent. All of that is documented. The man swallowed. His bravado flickered. And Daniel added, I have been observing the entire time. Grace and Evelyn stepped to either side of Daniel. Support, not shield. John looked down at his hands, relief and exhaustion mingling across his features. Marcus felt the tension inside him unwind, not entirely, but enough to breathe. The man sputtered. This is a misunderstanding. Daniel's tone didn't waver. Sir, you will remain seated and silent for the remainder of the flight. When we land, ground security will speak with you. If you refuse to comply, I will intervene more formally. The man's face paled. Intervene? With what? Daniel didn't raise his voice. With authority. A hush fell across the cabin. The man looked from Daniel to Grace to the passengers quietly watching him. And finally, he set the phone down. Daniel gave a small nod to the attendants. Continue the flight. I'll stay near. It was not the end. It was the moment the balance finally shifted. The power flip had begun. Daniel Avery didn't return to his seat. He stayed standing, one hand resting lightly on a headrest of row 23, posture controlled, presence unmistakable. The cabin felt different now. Not relaxed. No one could relax yet, but steadier, anchored by someone who understood authority not as force, but as responsibility. Grace and Evelyn exchanged glances of quiet relief. They resumed service with measured steps, each movement careful not to inflame the situation. The man in row 14 sat rigid, arms crossed, eyes darting between Daniel and the window. John exhaled softly. Thank goodness, he murmured. Marcus felt the shift too, but he sensed something else just beneath it. A final thread of defiance in the disruptive passenger, thin but still intact. People like him rarely surrendered without looking for one last opening. And that opening arrived from an unexpected direction. A passenger in row 13, a man in a business blazer, leaned forward and whispered just loud enough for nearby rows to catch. Honestly, maybe the guy was provoked. It wasn't said to defend the disruptive passenger. It was said carelessly, thoughtlessly, as if boredom had blended with judgment. But the man in row 14 latched onto it. Exactly, he barked. Someone sees the truth. Daniel stepped closer immediately. Not threatening, just present. Sir, remain quiet. The man ignored him. See, I'm not the bad guy here. The businessman in row 13 went pale. I didn't mean, but the damage was done. The disruptive passenger straightened, renewed by the tiny crumb of perceived validation. His volume rose, as did the tempo of his breathing. I knew it, he said, pointing at Grace again. You all targeted me from the start. Sir, Evelyn warned, this is your final. No more threats. I want the captain right here. Sir, Daniel said, crisp and calm, you are done giving commands. Something in the man snapped. This is a setup, he muttered. I see what's happening. The plane hit a very slight dip, barely turbulence, more like a shift in wind, and the moment magnified it into drama. The man grabbed the back of the seat in front of him and stood again. Passengers gasped. Several hands reached for call buttons. Daniel moved instantly, one controlled step forward, square stance, hand raised. Sir, sit down. I'm being framed, the man shouted. John recoiled toward the window. Marcus stood halfway, instinctively putting himself between John and the aisle. And then, Daniel's voice changed. Not louder, not harsher, just unmistakably command. Sir, you are interfering with a federal officer. Sit down immediately. The words cut the air with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. The disruptive passenger froze. His mind seemed to race through possibilities, charges, consequences, headlines, explanations. None favored him. Daniel continued, If you do not comply, I will initiate restraint protocol. It wasn't a threat. It was an inevitability spoken aloud. Evelyn moved with quiet readiness. Grace contacted the cockpit again, her voice steady. Captain, escalation confirmed. The man's jaw trembled. His knuckles whitened on the seat back, but something inside him cracked. He dropped heavily into his seat. Daniel didn't sit. He remained standing 2 rows behind him, arms relaxed at his sides, alert but calm. The businessman in row 13 whispered, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make it worse. Marcus spoke gently. Then stay quiet now. Let them handle it. The man nodded, chastened. Grace stepped to John. Are you okay? She asked softly. John tried to laugh, but it came out thin. I will be. Marcus watched Daniel carefully. The air marshal wasn't triumphant. He wasn't smug. He simply remained vigilant, a quiet sentinel stabilizing a rattled cabin. And then unexpectedly, almost too quietly to hear, the disruptive passenger whispered, I didn't think it would go this far. Marcus heard it because he was closest. He didn't respond. Sometimes the weight of consequences didn't need a witness. Daniel finally spoke again, voice low but firm. Sir, when we land, you will stay seated until instructed otherwise. Security will meet you at the door. The man closed his eyes. John whispered to Marcus, Do you think he'll calm down for the rest of the flight? Marcus nodded slowly. He doesn't have another choice. But he knew the deeper truth. Accountability wasn't just coming. It was already here, embodied in the quiet man in row 24 who had stepped forward at precisely the right moment. The plane leveled smoothly. Lights dimmed. The tension eased, but did not vanish. Because the real turning point wasn't the intervention. It was what would happen when the aircraft touched down, and how the crew and Daniel would ensure justice was served with dignity, not spectacle. The approach into Seattle began with a gentle descent, barely noticeable, just a slight shift in the cabin's angle. But for the passengers, it felt like the closing of a long, strained chapter. Seatbacks straightened, windows adjusted, shoulders lowered. Everyone sensed that what happened next would determine the true outcome of the flight. Daniel Avery remained standing, positioned 2 rows behind the disruptive passenger. His stance was calm but unmistakably prepared. Grace and Evelyn moved through final cabin checks, each step steady, each glance purposeful. They no longer had to manage chaos. They simply had to guide the plane to a dignified finish. Marcus breathed slowly, grounding himself. The weight in his chest felt lighter now, though not gone. It wasn't fear. It was responsibility. He kept thinking about Emily waiting in her rehearsal hall, trusting him to be someone she could admire. He wondered how he would describe this moment to her later, how to make sense of a conflict resolved through courage, patience, and quiet authority. John sat straighter, hands finally resting loosely on his knees. The strain around his eyes had softened. Almost there, he whispered. Marcus nodded. You held yourself well. Not everyone could. John gave a modest shrug. Didn't feel like it. Before Marcus could respond, the intercom chimed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've begun our descent into Seattle. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation. It was a standard announcement, but his tone held a subtle gravity. He knew what awaited at the gate. A few rows up, the man in row 14 shifted. He wasn't ranting now. His defiance had quieted into a rigid, defensive stillness, like someone preparing for a consequence he still hoped to avoid. Grace approached him for the final seatbelt check. Sir, please ensure your tray table is up. He complied without speaking. His hands trembled slightly. Thank you, she said, her voice professional, not punitive. The man swallowed. Is this really necessary? Not shouted. Not scornful. Just uncertain. Daniel stepped forward, but his tone remained calm. Yes, sir. It is. You'll have a chance to speak with ground personnel once we land. I didn't mean to, the man began. Daniel didn't allow the narrative to bend. What matters now is your cooperation. The man nodded stiffly, the first sign of genuine submission since the air marshal revealed himself. Across the cabin, passengers exchanged glances, some sympathetic, most simply relieved. Justice didn't need to be harsh to be clear. And in this moment, clarity was exactly what the plane needed. Evelyn paused beside Marcus. You okay? Yes, Marcus said. You handled everything with grace. She smiled softly. We've trained for a lot of scenarios, but people still surprise you. Today. I'm glad we weren't alone. Her eyes flicked toward Daniel, the quiet pillar who had stepped forward at the exact moment of necessity. The plane dipped again, flaps extending with a mechanical whir. Seattle's gray coastline appeared through the windows, scattered with boats like small white punctuation marks. John leaned closer to the window. His voice held relief. It's beautiful from up here. Marcus nodded. It is, but his attention drifted back to the row behind him, to Daniel, who now leaned slightly forward as if analyzing every sound and movement. He wasn't tense, but he was present in a way that carried the weight of training. Finally, the wheels touched down with a soft, controlled bounce. Passengers exhaled as the thrust reversers roared briefly and then faded. The plane slowed, turned, taxied. Then the captain spoke again. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be parking shortly at gate C12. For safety reasons, please remain seated until our crew announces otherwise. A coded message, clear to anyone who had followed the confrontation. The disruptive passenger sank deeper into his seat. Are they awaiting for me? Daniel answered simply. Yes. For the first time, the man looked truly humbled. He stared at his hands, no longer tapping or fidgeting. Just still. Marcus felt a quiet empathy, not forgiveness, not excusing, but understanding. People carry darkness from places unseen, but consequences, handled with dignity, could illuminate new paths. As the plane eased toward the jet bridge, Grace made eye contact with Marcus and John. Stay seated until we clear the aisle. We want to make this smooth for everyone. Marcus nodded. John agreed. The engines powered down. The cabin brightened. Passengers adjusted belongings. But no one stood. Everyone waited for the final step, the moment the crew would escort the man forward and into the hands of ground security. Marcus realized the cabin had unified in a way he hadn't expected, not in hostility, but in shared resolve. A quiet, collective understanding that dignity would conclude what disruption began. Daniel repositioned himself. Grace approached the front. Evelyn opened the door the moment the jet bridge connected. And then, a uniformed officer stepped aboard. The next moment would put the entire journey into its final stage. Gate C12 smelled of jet fuel and rain. Seattle's low clouds pressed soft light across the jet bridge as passengers waited. The cabin remained still, a congregation of strangers who had watched a judgment unfold at 30,000 feet. Marcus felt the quiet settle like dust, settled, but not yet cleansed. The uniformed officer who stepped aboard introduced himself with a crisp nod and a badge flash. His presence made the finality of the moment clear. He walked with the measured confidence of someone who had rehearsed this arrival a dozen times for different reasons: paperwork, witness statements, careful handling. He paused by the disruptive passenger and spoke quietly. The man lowered his head, shoulders folding under the public weight of consequence. You will come with me, the officer said plainly. No theatrics. No vindictiveness. Only procedure. The man murmured something, an apology perhaps, a protest perhaps, but his voice was small and private. He stood and moved forward with the officer, guided but not manhandled, into the corridor of voices that would mark his immediate accountability. Passengers watched the interaction with a mix of relief and human curiosity. Some looked embarrassed for having borne witness. Others met each other's eyes, a brief exchange of shared sobriety. John exhaled a sound Marcus hoped would steady him for the rest of the day. Daniel remained where he had been, in the cabin, alert but not intrusive, his role a quiet scaffolding for what came next. He allowed Grace and Evelyn to lead the crew's final procedures, and then, when that was done, he approached the front galley. You handled that very well, he told them, voice low so only they could hear. He left out any credit. He offered only a simple affirmation of professionalism, something worth hearing after a long stretch of tense labor. Grace nodded, fatigue and gratitude washing across her face in equal measure. "We couldn't have done it without you," she replied. She meant it. The crew had authority rooted in rules and training. Daniel's attention had brought an additional layer of security at precisely the moment it mattered. Evelyn added, "We'll file our report, and we'll make sure Mr. Rivera receives the documentation he needs." That exchange made everything feel official in the way ritual can, an act that converts a moment into a record, a memory into a basis for action. Once the jet bridge connected and the passengers began to disembark in small waves, people moved with a new softness of those who had been near conflict and survived it. Marcus stood slowly, gathering his small carry-on. He felt the ache of adrenaline leaving his limbs, replaced by sober clarity. Incidents like this could be a turning point, not just for the persons involved, but for broader practice and policy. Outside the jet bridge, ground security officers waited with clipboards and radios, their faces expressing the routine gravity of people who dealt with authority regularly. The disruptive passenger had already been briefed and processed toward a waiting security vehicle. Marcus watched him go, head bowed, shoulders hunched, and felt a complicated empathy. Accountability, he thought, was not merely punishment. It was an opportunity for someone to see consequences clearly and perhaps begin to change. As passengers filtered through the small, humid jetway into the terminal, a man in an airline uniform directed them toward an area with benches and a short cluster of service desks. The crew, Grace and Evelyn, were asked to provide statements at one desk. Marcus lingered near John. "You okay to go?" Marcus asked. John blinked, the strain easing into a cautious smile. "I think so. I'm a little shook up, but I'm fine. Thanks for stepping in." Marcus smiled back, the kind of smile that doesn't pretend at heroism. "You didn't need me. You handled yourself." John shook his head. "No, you helped. I might have stayed quiet forever." They both laughed softly, an honest, healing sound. Grace completed her notes and handed them to the officer. "We took all required action," she said. "We'll attach the witness statements and the timeline." Evelyn added, "We'll also include Mr. Rivera's recording and state that Mr. Hale and others assisted." Marcus felt the weight of that documentation. He knew it would matter, perhaps not in a headline, but in a ledger that could lead to training changes or a concrete response from the airline. Records could push a complaint out of the pile and into action. At a small airport cafe, the terminal buzz softened to ordinary noise, trolleys, luggage wheels, the murmur of arrivals. Marcus and John found seats under a strip of a window that fogged slightly in the rain. John thumbed his phone, pulling up the recording he'd made. The audio was clear enough. The man's voice, the attendant's measured commands, Daniel's calm intervention. Marcus listened, the sound coming through as another layer of truth. "Do you own this for a reason?" John asked suddenly. Marcus thought of Emily's photo in his pocket, the one that had nudged him toward involvement. He thought of the little ledger in his head, of missed chances and small admissions of courage. "I keep a record of things that matter," he said finally. "Not for rage. For proof." John nodded. "Me too. For peace of mind." They sat for a while in companionable quiet. Around them, strangers moved through their separate days. For Marcus, the moment felt like a hinge, an episode where dignity had been defended by ordinary people, a flight crew, a hidden marshal, and a man who decided not to look away. A week later, emails began to land. The airline thanked Grace and Evelyn for their professionalism and pledged to review the incident report for any policy improvements. The second message came from a community organization that advocated against in-flight harassment. They asked for the crew's permission to use the encounter as an example in their training seminars, highlighting bystander action, the importance of documentation, and the value of calm authority. Marcus and John both received short notes of support from fellow passengers who'd been aboard. One offered to serve as a witness in any future proceedings. Those responses mattered because they converted immediate action into potential systemic change. Marcus felt a cautious satisfaction, the kind that came from seeing a small, local event ripple outward. In the days that followed, Marcus noticed subtle shifts in his own life. He called Emily more often, not to lecture her, but to listen. He began volunteering at a local community center, offering basic tech help for seniors, small, practical contributions that felt like a quiet giving back. John returned to his job with a slower step, a little less brittle, and shared his experience with coworkers who found themselves more aware of how to stand up without inflaming a situation. Then, 3 weeks later, Marcus received an unexpected letter from the airline. It was not a reprimand or a legal notice. It was a formal acknowledgement. The letter thanked him and other passengers for their calm and documented help. It also confirmed that the airline would be convening a panel to review training procedures regarding in-flight harassment and the protection of crew. The airline invited him, if he wished, to provide input on witness protections and documentation practices. Marcus read the letter twice. He felt the small tremor of validation, the knowledge that a single, composed choice might feed a more just process. He wrote back, accepting the invitation, and suggested a few practical changes: clearer signage about recording policies, guidance for passengers who wish to document incidents for evidence rather than confrontation, and a simple protocol for the crew to escalate when language or behavior cross certain lines. Months later, after forms, interviews, and a quiet meeting room with coffee, Marcus walked into a session where airline trainers and staff were compiling new checklists. He sat with Grace and Evelyn on the same side of the table as airline security officers and a representative from the community advocacy group. Daniel did not attend publicly. His role remained judiciously private, but his influence was present in the pragmatic clarity of the protocols. They discussed language, what counted as disruptive behavior, how to preserve dignity while documenting misconduct, and how to empower passengers to assist without escalating. They drafted small but workable changes: a clearer how to document instruction on the airline's app, an addendum to crew training on de-escalation that emphasized bystander coordination, a protocol for quietly notifying federal or local law enforcement when intervention was required. After the meeting, Marcus stepped outside into Seattle's wet evening. He felt no grand triumph, only a quiet completion, the small, steady progress of people making systems better than they found them. He pulled Emily's rehearsal photo from his pocket and looked at it, a private ritual that had guided him from the cabin to the meeting room. He dialed her number. "Dad," she answered, an immediate warmth in her voice. "I'm coming to your next show," he said simply. "And I'll tell you the whole story, if you want to hear it." There was a pause, and then laughter on the other end. "Of course I want to hear it." "Proud of you." Marcus smiled to himself as he looked out over the rain-slicked street. The consequence had not been televised. No one had shouted victory. But the small concrete reforms he'd helped seed would, he hoped, make other flights safer and more just. He folded the photo back into his pocket, and somewhere, in a not entirely closed ledger of right and wrong, a line had been added, not of retribution, but of renewed dignity. 3 months later, Seattle carried the soft gray of late spring. The air smelled of rain and new growth. Marcus walked down a quiet street toward the small community center, where he volunteered to help older neighbors with online forms and email. He moved with a lighter step than the day he left the plane, less the weight of tightened shoulders and more the steady tread of someone who'd acted when it mattered. The changes after the flight were not dramatic headlines. They were small, sensible shifts. Paperwork turned into policy drafts, conversations turned into checklists. Grace and Evelyn received commendations from the airline's regional office. The cruise report had been thorough: times, words, actions, and the audio John had recorded. The airline's training team convened a panel that included a representative from the advocacy group and a few passengers who'd agreed to share their perspective. Marcus had attended one meeting and then another. He found the process slow, but he appreciated that it existed. At the community center, a young volunteer handed Marcus a mug and a list of appointments. He set his things on the table and thought briefly of the flight, the hush after the marshal's quiet badge click, the way Daniel had stepped forward without fanfare. He kept those images not as trophies, but as instructions. Be ready, be calm, document what matters. His phone buzzed with an email from the airline. The subject line read, "Policy Update, Passenger Conduct and Documentation Protocols." Marcus opened it on a bench outside the center. The message outlined modest but concrete reforms: clearer passenger guidance in the airline app about when and how to document incidents, a standardized crew checklist for escalation, and a proposed pilot program to give crew access to a secure reporting channel that could be flagged directly to ground security. The email thanked passengers who provided witness statements and invited Marcus to sit in on a training module later that month. He walked into the center with a quiet satisfaction. Small ripples, he thought, could reach farther than a single shout. Across town, John had returned to his job at a maintenance hangar. He still carried the memory of hands trembling around an armrest, but he also carried a new assurance that people would back him, that there were systems now more likely to respond. He spoke at a brief safety meeting at work about the importance of speaking up in a measured way and about how recording an incident for evidence could be an act of protection for everyone aboard. Grace took a few days off and then returned to flying. She found a new steadiness in the routine, the same practice steps, but with the added knowledge that some passengers would now see clearer signs of how to record without escalating. Evelyn stayed on longer shifts for a couple of weeks, helping integrate the new checklist into everyday practice. Both women continued to wear the quiet pride of professionals who had navigated a difficult day without spectacle. The advocacy group used the incident, always anonymized, names withheld, to design a short training clip about respectful intervention and proper documentation. It was shown in a few corporate training rooms and community workshops. Daniel did not appear in any public materials, and the group respected his privacy. His role remained intentionally understated, a reminder that sometimes authority is most effective when it is measured, unseen until needed. One evening, Marcus attended Emily's small play. He sat in the second row, exactly where she had expected him, the rehearsal photo he'd kept now folded into the ticket as a symbolic talisman. When the curtain fell, she found him in the lobby and hugged him thoroughly, her voice bright with both relief and pride. "You should have seen Dad," she joked to the circle of cast and family. "He's practically a civic hero now." Marcus laughed, embarrassed and pleased. They did not speak of the flight in dramatic terms. Instead, over coffee afterward, they talked about small acts of courage and the slow work of being present for others. Emily said she was proud he'd stood up. He told her he hadn't thought of himself as a hero, only as someone doing what needed doing. Months later, at a training room near the airport, Marcus sat with Grace and Evelyn as trainers demonstrated the new reporting protocol. A soft click punctuated the room when a trainer tapped a badge onto a ring, an echo of the subtle, decisive sound Marcus had noticed months earlier. The badge click fell, now like a punctuation mark in a sentence that had finally been given a clearer structure. The reforms were not a cure for all harm. People would still fail each other in ways both petty and grave. But a measured system, dignified reporting, clear escalation, respectful intervention could change how those failures were addressed. It could give the small power of evidence to those who needed it and relieve frontline workers from bearing both authority and the sole burden of enforcement. On a rainy afternoon, Marcus received a short note from John. It was a simple message: "Thanks again. I'm okay. If you're ever in the area, coffee on me." Marcus replied with a plan to meet small, ordinary human. He also received a letter from the airline inviting him to appear in a closed training session to discuss the passenger perspective. He accepted. It felt right to translate a moment of personal choice into institutional guidance. It was not about praise. It was about preventing a repeat. Marcus folded Emily's rehearsal photo into his wallet, a private reminder that small things, an image, a polite nudge, a quiet recording, could add up to meaningful change. He walked home under an umbrella, the city's lights reflecting on wet pavement. As he crossed the street, he looked up at the plain tracks of vapor, high above, threads that connected city to city, people to people. He thought of Daniel's discreet authority, of Grace's calm hands, of Evelyn's careful notes, and of the passengers who had watched and, in their own ways, chosen dignity over indifference. In that small ledger of moments, entries of courage, of documentation, of consequence, Marcus added another line, a steady act of civic care. Not dramatic, not loud, just quiet, practical work that helped the system bend, slowly, toward better. He clicked his keychain once, a small, ordinary sound. It felt unexpectedly like a promise. Andy, thanks for watching.